Spring 1846. 87 American pioneers set out from Illinois with dreams of California gold and fertile land. They were families, mothers, fathers, children, seeking a better life on the other side of the continent. 1 year later, only 48 would survive. The rest would die in the snow, and some of them would be eaten by the others. This is the story of the Donner Party, and it all started with one wrong turn. It began innocently enough. George Donner, 60 years old, a respected farmer, and James Reed, 45, a successful businessman, organized a wagon train departing Springfield, Illinois that spring. Their destination, California. The promise of new land, opportunity, and sunshine drew 87 people to join them. 29 men, 15 women, and 43 children. Among them were the Donner and Reed families, along with hired hands and other pioneers seeking their fortune. But they made a critical mistake right from the start. They left late. In mid-May, the Donner Party departed Independence, Missouri, the jumping-off point for westward travel. They were the last major wagon train of the season. In pioneer travel, timing was everything. Leave too early, and there's no grass for your livestock. Leave too late, and winter catches you in the mountains. The Donner Party was already cutting it close. They had until early fall, maybe mid-autumn at the latest, to cross the Sierra Nevada before the snows came. Every day mattered. For months, the journey went as planned. The wagons rolled west across the Great Plains. The children played. Families sang songs around campfires. They were making decent time, following the established trail thousands had taken before them. And then they reached Fort Bridger, Wyoming. This is where everything changed. At Fort Bridger, they heard about a shortcut, the Hastings Cutoff, named after a guide named Lansford Hastings, who'd written a book promising a faster route to California. According to Hastings, this alternate path would cut 300 miles off the journey, maybe even weeks of travel time. For families running late, it sounded like a gift from God. James Reed was intrigued. He wanted to make up for lost time, but not everyone was convinced. Before reaching Fort Bridger, Reed had encountered an old friend, a mountain man named James Clyman. Clyman had just come from California via the Hastings Cutoff. He pulled Reed aside and gave him a warning. Don't take that route. It's barely passable on foot. With wagons and families? Impossible. Reed listened, and then he ignored him. In late July, the Donner Party turned off the main trail and onto the Hastings Cutoff. It was the decision that would doom them. The first sign of trouble came quickly. Hastings had promised an easy path through the Wasatch Mountains. Instead, the party found themselves hacking through dense brush and timber with axes, carving a road where none existed. The wagons could barely move. They lost 2 weeks just getting through the mountains. 2 weeks they didn't have. But the worst was yet to come. Next was the Great Salt Lake Desert. Hastings had written it would take 2 days to cross. It took 5. 5 days of blistering heat, no water, and burning white sand stretching to the horizon. Oxen collapsed and died. Families ran out of water. In desperation, they started abandoning wagons to lighten their loads. Precious belongings, furniture, family heirlooms, keepsakes from their old lives were dumped in the desert sand and left behind forever. They were losing precious days they couldn't afford to lose, and they were running out of everything they needed to survive. By early October, the group was fracturing. Exhaustion led to anger. Anger led to violence. On October 5th, 2 wagons got their ox teams tangled while trying to navigate a steep, sandy hill. John Snyder, one of the teamsters, lost it. He began beating his oxen with a whip, violently, mercilessly. James Reed, the aristocratic leader of the group, told him to stop, but Snyder turned on Reed. He swung the bullwhip and cracked it across Reed's skull, splitting it open. Blood poured down Reed's face. Reed pulled his knife out, but his wife, Margaret, rushed between them to stop the fight. Then Snyder struck her head with the whip. We don't know if it was blind rage or an unintentional hit, but we do know the consequences. Reed snapped. In his rage, he shoved the knife into Snyder's chest. Snyder collapsed in the dirt, gasping. That night, he died. The group held a trial. Their verdict, banishment. James Reed was forced to leave the wagon train, alone, on horseback, without his family. He rode west toward California, promising to send help back. His wife and children stayed behind, leaderless and unprotected. Reed nearly died on that journey. He lost his horse. He ran out of food. He stumbled into California on foot, half starved and barely alive. But he made it, and he kept his promise. Days later, the group made another decision that revealed just how desperate they'd become. An elderly Belgian man named Hardcoop could no longer keep up. He was slowing them down. They abandoned him on the side of the trail, sitting under a sagebrush, too weak to walk. No one ever saw him again. Then, a week later, Paiute Indians attacked. They shot 21 oxen with poison arrows. The animals died slowly, writhing in the dirt. The party's food supply, already critically low, was now crippled. And all around them, the weather was getting colder. By late September, every other wagon train that year had already made it to California. The Donner Party was alone on the trail. They were racing against a clock they couldn't see, and they were losing. But not everyone had given up hope. Two men, Charles Stanton and William McCutcheon, volunteered to ride ahead to California for help. It was a desperate gamble. They would race ahead, get supplies, and ride back before winter closed the pass. The families watched them disappear over the horizon. No one knew if they'd ever see them again. Halloween, the Donner Party finally reached Truckee Lake, now called Donner Lake. High in the Sierra Nevada mountains, they were just 100 miles from California, a week of travel under normal conditions. Safety was within reach. And then, something miraculous happened. Charles Stanton rode back into camp. He'd made it to California. He was safe. He could have stayed there, but he didn't. He loaded up mules with food and supplies and rode back into the mountains to save people he barely knew. He was their hero. That night, the sky opened up. An early winter storm slammed into the mountains. Snow fell in thick, heavy curtains. It piled up fast, feet of it in hours. By morning, the mountain pass ahead was completely blocked. The route that had been open just 24 hours earlier was now an impassable wall of ice and snow. They tried to push through. They couldn't. The wagons wouldn't move. The animals couldn't climb. The people could barely stand against the wind. They were trapped at 7,000 feet elevation, with winter just beginning. The Donner Party had no choice. They built crude cabins near the lake, using whatever materials they could find: logs, canvas, dirt. The Donner family, whose wagons had broken down earlier, set up camp 6 miles away at Alder Creek. Then the snow came again. 8 straight days of snow. Most of their remaining oxen wandered off into the storm and disappeared. The group was now split into 2 camps, cut off from each other and from the outside world. The window had closed. They would spend the winter in the mountains. At first, they ate what they had: the remaining oxen, the horses, the dogs. They boiled leather hides until they were soft enough to chew. They scraped and ate the rugs from their wagon floors. Then, one by one, people started dying. The cold, the hunger, the sickness, bodies piled up in the snow outside the cabins. And the survivors faced a terrible reality. They were out of food. 6 weeks later, 15 of the strongest members made a desperate decision. They strapped on makeshift snowshoes and attempted to hike out of the mountains on foot. It was a suicide mission, but staying meant certain death. The group called themselves the Forlorn Hope. 10 men and 5 women. Charles Stanton, the man who'd already saved them once, volunteered to guide them out. They carried almost no food, maybe enough for 6 days. The journey to the nearest settlement would take at least 2 weeks. They left at dawn. Within days, they were starving. On Christmas Eve, a man named Antonio died. His body lay in the snow. The survivors stared at it. They knew what they had to do. Some refused, some prayed, but hunger erased their humanity. They cut the flesh from his bones and roasted it over a fire. Then they ate. The Forlorn Hope wandered through the mountains for 33 days. One by one, more died. And one by one, their bodies were consumed by the survivors. And then, Charles Stanton went blind. Snow blindness and exhaustion had taken his sight. He could no longer walk. The group faced another impossible choice: stay with him and die, or leave him behind and live. Stanton made the choice for them. He sat down against a tree, pulled out his pipe, and calmly told them to go on without him. He would smoke and rest, he said. They should save themselves. They left him there. He died alone in the snow so that others could survive. 8 of the 15 died. 7 made it out alive. When they finally stumbled into a California settlement in mid-January, they were skeletal, frostbitten, and delirious. They told their story, and the rescue missions began. Back at the lake, the people still trapped in the cabins had run out of options. They chewed on pine bark. They caught and ate field mice. They boiled bones into a thin, flavorless broth. And when that ran out, they did what the forlorn hope had done. They began eating the dead. But even in this hell, there was a rule, an unspoken contract born of desperation and horror. No one would eat their own relatives. They couldn't bear that final violation. So they marked the bodies. They swapped flesh between camps so that no mother would have to feed her children the body of their father. It was a desperate attempt to preserve some shred of civilization in the midst of unspeakable darkness. Nearly 4 months after the group became trapped, the first rescue party finally reached the camps. What they found was a scene from a nightmare. Human skeletons littered the snow. Bodies were mutilated, limbs missing, skulls cracked open. Inside the cabins, survivors sat in the dark, too weak to move, surrounded by the remains of their friends and family. The rescuers could only take a few people at a time. The journey back through the snow was brutal. They selected those strong enough to walk and left the weakest behind with promises to return. Among those left behind was Tamsin Donner. She was at the Alder Creek camp with her husband George, who was dying from an infected hand wound. When the rescuers arrived, they told Tamsin she could leave. She was strong enough to make it. But George couldn't walk. He was too sick. The rescuers wouldn't take him. Tamsin faced an impossible choice. She could save herself and abandon her dying husband, or she could stay and die with him. She wrapped her 3 young daughters in blankets and kissed them goodbye. She sent them out with the rescuers into the snow, and then she sat back down beside her husband. She would not let him die alone. The second relief party was organized and funded by James Reed, the man who'd been banished months earlier. He raised money in California, he gathered men, and he led them back into the mountains to save the people who had cast him out. As Reed and his team climbed through the snow, they encountered the first relief coming down with survivors. And there, in the middle of the frozen wilderness, Reed found his own wife and children. Against all odds, his family had survived. The man who'd been exiled had become their savior. But the second relief mission would become a nightmare of its own. As they were leading a group of refugees back down the mountain, a massive storm hit. The snow came down in blinding sheets. The wind howled. The group couldn't move forward. They were trapped. The rescuers made a terrible decision. They couldn't save everyone. They dug a pit in the snow, a makeshift shelter, and left behind the weakest refugees with a tiny amount of food. They promised to send help as soon as they could reach the valley. Then they continued down the mountain with those who could still walk. The people left in that pit, later known as Starved Camp, waited in the darkness. Days passed, the food ran out, and people started dying in the snow around them. When the third relief arrived days later, they found the children huddled in the pit, gnawing on the charred bones of the adults who died. The horror had reached a new depth. Even the rescuers, hardened men who'd already seen the camps, were shaken by what they found. 2 months after the first rescue, the fourth and final party arrived at the lake. They found one person left alive. His name was Louis Kieseberg. He was sitting in a cabin, alone, next to a pot of boiling human flesh. Nearby was the mutilated body of George Donner, the man who'd led the expedition. Kieseberg had George Donner's gold coins in his pocket, and when questioned, he admitted to eating Tamsin Donner, the wife who had chosen to stay behind and die with her husband. The rescuers dragged him out. Days later, the last survivor reached Sutter's Fort in California. The ordeal was over. Of the 87 people who started the journey, 48 survived, 39 died. 2/3 of the women and children made it out alive, but only 1/3 of the men survived. At least 21 members of the party had been cannibalized. 32 of the survivors were children who had witnessed things no person should ever see. Louis Kieseberg, the man who ate expedition leader George Donner and his wife, was later tried for murder. He was found not guilty, but the rumors followed him for the rest of his life. Some called him a monster. Others said he simply did what he had to do to survive. He never escaped the shadow of what happened in those mountains. The survivors scattered across California. Some tried to rebuild their lives. Others were destroyed by what they'd experienced and what they'd done. The psychological scars never healed. One wrong turn, that's all it took. A shortcut that wasn't a shortcut. A gamble that cost 39 lives and transformed ordinary pioneers into something they never imagined they could become. The Donner Party remains one of the darkest chapters in American frontier history. A reminder that survival doesn't come without a cost, and sometimes that cost is your humanity.